All right, we are on chapter 4 of our story, The Night Divided. The last thing that we read in chapter 3 was, "We will never be able to leave," Mama said. "The sooner you both accept that, the happier you will be." I nodded back at her, but I knew I could never again be happy here, and I refused to accept my life inside a prison. Chapter 4. Mama once said the most wonderful thing about being young is our ability to make things normal. That whatever life does to us, no matter how strange, it isn't long before insanity seems ordinary, as if upside down is the way things should be. That didn't make sense to me at first, but over the next 4 years after the wall went up, I saw it happen more and more. Most children barely noticed the wall any longer. They played hoops beneath the eyes of armed border guards in their watchtowers, rolled marbles in the shade of the wall, and learned to do as they were told without asking questions. I was 12 years old now, and the older I got, the more separate I felt from the other kids my age. Because I always noticed the wall, always, over the past 4 years, I had learned to read the guards high up in the watchtowers and know when they were looking and when they had turned away. I knew when and where the guards did their patrols along the border and where they didn't often go. And more than anything, I knew that nothing happening to us was normal. The only one who really understood that was Fritz, who said it was because I had Papa's blood in me. Not a single morning had passed in the last 4 years when I didn't think of my father and the courage he would expect from me. My walk to school passed very close to the wall, or as close as we were allowed to get anyway. I usually made the walk alongside my only friend, Anna, who was as timid and shy as I was bold and outspoken. Where I had blonde hair, round eyes, and athletic body, Anna had darker hair, eyes that nearly disappeared when she smiled, and a thin frame that looked as if she needed to be fed. She worked very hard to stay out of trouble, which made her an ideal friend for me. Unfortunately, my ability to avoid trouble was less skilled. I probably wasn't the perfect friend for her. Today felt uncommonly cold. I was enduring it and hoping not to arrive at school frostbitten. As usual, between us, Anna had made the wiser choice. She was wrapped in scarves until there wasn't much visible except for her eyes and mouth. I'd barely remembered my coat. "There's a pioneer meeting today," Anna said through what looked like 18 layers of wool. "Are you going?" I groaned. We went to school to study letters and numbers, then stayed at school as members of the pioneers and learned why freedom was overrated, why individuality was bad, and why we must always avoid the evil influences of the West, such as fancy clothes and Beatles music. I loved the Beatles, but not even Anna knew about that. That secret was only for Fritz and me. He had bought one of their albums, smuggled in through the black market, and he and I listened to it very low on nights when the streets were crowded and noisy. "Of course I'm going," I said. Not attending could bring my mother a visit from the school administrators, and none of us wanted that. Over the last 4 years, we'd already had too many questions from the school, the police, and even the Stasi about my father. Nothing in East Germany frightened me more than the Stasi. We always knew they were there, even when we couldn't see them. They existed to protect our country from enemies, either foreign spies trying to get in or traitors who wanted to get out. My family wasn't either, but that didn't mean we were safe. After my father left, I had thought there'd be no need for them to visit us anymore, but they obviously disagreed. They had last come almost 2 years ago, late at night, long after we should have been in bed. I think their timing was meant to make us nervous, and from the looks on my family's faces, it worked. Fritz and I had sat on either side of Mama on the couch while she answered their questions. I kept an eye on their weapons. If they'd only come to ask questions, why did they bring guns? The Stasi officer who had sat in Papa's old chair was on his second cigarette before the hard questions came. Has Aldous Lowe returned to East Berlin? I was sure I could hear Mama's heart pounding beside me. Or maybe it was mine, because the officer's tone made it clear that he was no friend to my father. Mama shook her head, and if she was trying to answer in a calm voice, it didn't work. I have not seen my husband since the wall went up. Good, the officer said. We will arrest him if he does return. He took a long drag on his cigarette. Does he continue to work against the government? He never did, Mama said. Another man who had stood by the door walked forward with photos that he placed in her hands. I leaned over just enough to see an old picture of my father and Herr Kraus, both with stacks of leaflets in their hands. I didn't know what was on them, but from the terrorist expression on the officer's face, it was obviously something more than party invitations or store coupons. Mama quickly handed the photos back. I have no idea what my husband is doing now. He does not involve us in those activities and never did. He never involved Mama or me, but Fritz hadn't looked at the pictures, and I wondered if that was because he already knew what my father had been doing. Has Aldous Lowe tried to contact you? The officer said. Mama shook her head, but when she paused for too long, I spoke for her. We have no letters, and you cut the phone lines to the west on barbed wire Sunday. The officer turned his attention to me. His eyes were like ice on my bare skin. I cut some of them myself, child. Does that anger you? Of course it did, but he had the gun, so I only looked down while Mama made humble apologies for my boldness and gripped my wrist like a vase. Stasi left soon afterward, but even now, 2 years later, I still felt a chill whenever I thought of them. Since that night, Mama carefully made sure we did everything that might be expected of a good East German family. We waved our flags at the parades and smiled at the leaders of the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, our communist government. Fritz joined the Free German Youth and made plans to enroll at the university one day. And at the beginning of every school year, I joined the Pioneers, with Anna at my side. I participated in their meetings and activities, chanted the slogan to be ready, always ready, and wore the blue scarf and white shirt uniform on every holiday when it was required. If anyone was watching us, and we were suspected they were, my family now looked as loyal as the best of them. Gerda, stop staring at the wall, Anna whispered to me. Do you think the soldiers don't notice? I think it's too cold for them to bother with me, I said. They watch the university students and the men whose families are on the other side. They don't watch 12-year-old girls on their way to school. Yes, they do, Anna insisted. Turn away, please. Look at anything else. At what? I gestured around me. There's nothing else to see. With all this gray around us, it's hard to remember we live in a world of color. We call it communist gray. It was the color of our buildings, our markets, and our streets. The color of the wall. Even the skies were gray today. Somehow the GDR must have figured out how to bleach that out too. But because I knew it bothered Anna, I stopped looking, and she and I fell into a conversation about the latest hair fashions. It was the sort of conversation two ordinary girls might have on a particularly ordinary day, even if one of those girls had her mind on something else entirely, as I always did. I became so distracted by my thoughts, in fact, that I barely noticed when Anna stopped talking. I probably wouldn't have realized she had stopped walking either if she had not spoken my name. Gerda, look! Gerda, look! I stopped and turned back to her. To my surprise, Anna stood directly facing the wall. Gerda, is that your brother? Several meters away, across the large scar of land that had become forbidden territory, a boy stood alone on a platform behind the wall in West Berlin. I usually tried to ignore the Westerners on those platforms because they made me feel like an exhibit in a zoo. I didn't want their looks of pity or sadness, or especially the occasional homesick expression, to return to this lesser half of the city. But the boy on the platform seemed to be staring directly at me, and I squinted to see him better. It had been 4 years since I had seen Dominic, and he would be 14 now. Mama kept a picture of him in the front room, and I mentally compared that with the boy now facing me. His face had lengthened and narrowed, but the hair peeking out from his knitted cap seemed about the right color. I would know if I saw his eyes, but that was impossible from this distance. Still, there was something in his posture, the way he held one shoulder higher than the other. Dominic used to do that. I remembered because my mother always reminded him to stand up straight. It had been a long time since my smile had stretched so wide. "That's him," I said. "That's my brother." He seemed to recognize me too, or at least he waved. I raised my hand back at him, although such a simple gesture was far too casual for the importance of this moment. For almost 4 years, neither of us had heard a word about the other, and all we could do now was wave in silence. "Does something over there interest you?" I turned to see a border guard standing right behind Anna and me, close enough that I could see the stitching of his black gloves. He was shorter than average, with white blond hair shaved so close to his head that he almost looked bald. He was several years older than Fritz, but there were a lot of patches on his uniform, so I gathered he was more than a low-level officer. His name, stitched onto the uniform, was Mueller, and he stared down as if frightening me entertained him. Mueller had come up so quietly that neither of us heard him, but I should have known. Grenzers often patrolled this area. Of course, my wave to Dominic would have caught one's attention. Beside me, Anna had turned to stone, or something like it. She wasn't moving and possibly wasn't breathing either. Not me. I wanted to look up as far as his eyes, stare him in the face, and tell him there was no crime in looking across the wall. More than anything, I wanted to show him I wasn't afraid, except that I was. Mueller's rifle hung around his shoulder directly in front of me, and he had one hand on the stock. Maybe it was only my imagination, but I could have sworn that the rifle smelled like blood, as if he had used it on someone before. He lifted his head, he lifted it over his head and moved his other hand to the trigger. "I asked you a question," Mueller said. "Who were you waving at?" I turned back, but Dominic had disappeared by then, so I lowered my eyes and said to the officer, "It was nobody, sir." "You'd better remember that next time someone over there waves at you." He let the cold metal barrel brush against my cheek, then ran it beneath my chin and pushed my head up to face him. "Because those who get too curious about the other side sometimes get a taste of my bullets." I stared into his icy blue eyes and tried not to let any hatred show in mine. "Yes," I whispered. "I understand exactly who you are." "Then move along. Don't let me catch you stopping here again." I whispered another thanks to him, which almost immediately began to eat at my sense of justice. Then I grabbed Anna's arm. As terrified as I had been, she seemed worse. Her skin was deathly pale, and she leaned hard against me as we walked away. When Officer Mueller was out of our sight, Anna released a gasp of air and then said to me, "Promise me you'll never stop there again, no matter who you see on the other side. Promise me, Gerda." Though her reddened eyes begged me to agree with her, I couldn't. Maybe I could promise to be more careful next time I stopped, but that was all. I didn't tell her that. She'd have launched into a fit of hysterics, which would have brought on Muller's attention again. So I clutched her arm tighter as we continued to walk. My heart was pounding, just as hers surely was, but for an entirely different reason. All I could think was that after 4 long years, I had finally seen my brother, and I hoped it wasn't for the last time.